What's going on, you guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today's video is going to be taking a look at how to define and call functions in Python. So the basic idea of a function in Python is that you are grouping a certain amount of code that you may want to reuse over time with different variables leading to a different result. And so whereas in Python, say you just had two numbers and you wanted to add them together, you're allowed to say like sum equals 1 plus 2. Okay, and if you run this code, it's going to store the value of 3 in the sum, and you can test that by using print and saying, well, just print out the sum. Okay, and so if I run this, you can see I get 3, and that's great. A lot of you who are familiar with variables even know that you could make two variables, like number 1 equals 5, and number 2 equals 10. And then you could set sum equal to number 1 and plus number 2. So there we go. And then if I print sum now, you'll see it's 15. I can update the value of sum just by updating number 1 and number 2 in these variables. But what you've done here is you have technically written a function, but you haven't grouped it in any sort of way where it can be called from the outside world. And so we're going to take a look at how to do that using a few different examples in Python in this video. And one of them we'll start with sum. So let's go ahead and just take a look at how you create a function. First thing is you do def, which is define, and essentially that's Python shorthand for define a function. And we'll call it sum. So we'll say define sum, and then you always put these parentheses when you're creating a function, and what goes inside those parentheses is what variables are getting passed in. So there are a couple ways to write almost every function. A lot of the time you can create some of the code inside of it without needing to pass any variables in. We'll take a look at two different ways to do this sum. So let's say, just like we've had it written here, let's say you're passing in two numbers. So we're going to pass two numbers in, and then you put a colon, and tabbing is very important in Python. So if you're unfamiliar with object-oriented programming or Python specifically, you want to make sure that you're one tab level inside of any function, inside any if or while loop or anything like that. That's just general Python knowledge. But then what you do to get data back from Python inside of a function is you use the return. And so in the case of a sum function, we're going to do number 1 plus number 2, and that's basically saying what we want to return is the sum of these two numbers. You could also use an intermediate variable if you wanted to. You could say, sum equals, just like we did on the outside, and sum equals this number 1 plus number 2. And then you could return the sum. This maybe is a little bit cleaner to look at. It may be, for you as a beginner programmer, maybe this just helps you order your brain a little bit better. But I'm going to go ahead and put it back the other way, because this is just the shortest, fastest way to return the sum of two numbers. Now, of course, you wouldn't probably write a function just for adding two numbers together. You would add some more levels to it, which we'll take a look a little bit later in the video at how to kind of create some more useful examples with these functions. But okay, so now the thing that really people, I think, want to know is how do you call a function once you've created it. So we've created this sum function, that's great, but it hasn't really done anything. You'll see if I run this, it actually won't give me anything, because just writing the function doesn't do anything. It's not being called. So what you have to do to call a function is you have to type in the name of the function and then the parentheses, and then you put some variables inside of it. So let's just start with 2 and 3 as our two numbers, and we'll see it runs, but we're not printing anything because there's no display inside of the function. So if we print the sum, then now when it returns the number 1 plus number 2, that's what's going to be executed here, and then we're going to print that onto the console. So there you see we run it, we get 5. And that's pretty cool. This can be coupled essentially, like let's say we wanted to write this entire program just for the purpose of summing two numbers. You could say num1 equals integer input, and if you're completely confused by this input print formatting, I suggest you go back to the Learn Python for Beginners tutorial series that's on this channel, and it'll go from everything from downloading and installing Python to how to get user input, how to use type conversions, and things that you're seeing in this video. So I am trying to go kind of slow and explain everything as I do it, but there are concepts that you can get elsewhere that'll help you understand what's going on here. But essentially, if we said num integer input enter first number, and what we're doing right now is we're prompting the user for those numbers. And so this way you can see every time we run this function, we are going to have the option as the user of actually generating a different sum based on our input. So what I just did is I set up two inputs that are asking for the first and second number. I'm storing those in these variables num1 and num2. We pass that into the function, and you can see I intentionally gave them different names here in the outside world versus inside the function. That is typically the best practice, because if I were to use num1 in here, it's even going to recommend, hey, this shadows the name from the outside scope. Essentially, like, you named it something in here, it will work in here if you want it to, but it could get really confusing if you look at your program or you're debugging and you have num1, num2 in multiple locations. So I recommend using different names for your variables when you create them in the outside world versus inside of your function. But let's go ahead and run this. So enter first number. I'm going to go with 5. Enter second number. Go with another 5. And it prints a 10 out on the screen. So right there, that's just kind of a crash course in how to call a function. Now let's say we put this prompting inside of the function, okay? Because I think I mentioned earlier, you can create a function that doesn't have any variables. So let's say we put, when you call summation, we also want to gather the user info inside of that function. Then all we would do when we call this function now is we just say sum and then empty brackets. And now it should operate exactly like the way we just ran it. So you just saw us run the function, it asked you for two numbers, and then it returned the sum. This is probably actually the better way to create this program, where if you were to design a function and then hand it off to someone else on your team and say, all you have to do is run the function and we'll handle gathering user input, everything else, it's a complete solution just in its own. This is probably the better way to do it, because now you'll see when we run it, enter first number, 5, enter second number, 12, and we get 17 back. But the difference is, all someone that you gave this to would have to do is run, sum. And they wouldn't have to know that they also have to add a few input lines of code. And so one more thing, because I put the function inside of print for that purpose of displaying the result. But typically, if you want to get the result of something back, so let's say we ran the sum function and we wanted to put in a local variable that was like, I'll just call it local sum. Okay, so we could then use local sum as anything we want and modify it and increment it and use it later on in our program as much as we want. So we could say local sum plus 5 for whatever reason. And let's go ahead and just print that out. So now what we're going to do is when I run this program, it's going to come down here. It's going to see, oh, I have to run the sum function to put a number inside local sum. But then what we're actually going to display on the screen is that result plus 5 that we modified. So this will be kind of an interesting explanation of how functions can get called. But let's say right now we're running the sum function. So we did 12 plus 6, which is 18. But then we came down and we added 5 to it. So another way of maybe explaining that is if we did a local sum 2 that was also equal to the sum function. And then what we're going to print out is local sum 2 plus local sum 1. So this is maybe kind of silly. Maybe what would make sense is if we had done subtraction or something there. But okay, we did 12 plus 9. It stored that value in the variable local sum, and we're running it again. So let's do 90 plus 1. And what it just did is it added 21, which was the first local sum, to 91 for 112. So that's just a way of showing how you can create and call functions, as well as how to store the return value from those functions inside of a variable, as well as how you can use and manipulate that variable later on in your program. So this was a basic Python tutorial. I hope you found it useful. Certainly a lot of the videos on this channel do build on these concepts and kind of expand it to more cool things. One of the first videos I did using a lot of functions was creating a 4-function calculator in Python, where we gather what operation a user wants to do, whether it's division, multiplication, subtraction, and processes your inputs based on what you've entered. And that uses a lot of calling functions and returning outputs based on those functions. So that would kind of be the logical next step in your learning. I recommend checking that video out if you have more interest. If you got confused about anything, or there's something specific you want to see on the channel, just let me know about in the comments below. I'll get back to you as soon as I can, or possibly make a video on it. I hope you found this useful. I really appreciate a like to the video, a subscribe to the channel if you did. It helps me out a ton with the YouTube algorithm. And as always, good luck with your code, and thanks for watching. Thanks. Bye.